Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Developing and Supporting Families in Transitioning from Foster Care to Adoption. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate in today's event. You have two options for dialing in on the audio, computer audio or via the phone. To switch between the two, just click on the circle next to your preferred audio option in the audio section of your control panel. You do have the opportunity to submit text questions to our presenters today by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You can send your questions in at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them throughout today's presentation. I would now like to go ahead and introduce Britt Clousdale.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day today to join us for this Adopt US Kids webinar. We really hope you'll find this webinar to be informative and that it will help you improve your work with families during what can be a really vulnerable period of their lives. As Lucy mentioned, my name is Britt Clousdale. I am with the Adopt US Kids Family Support Team, and I would like to first go ahead and introduce our presenters. We have Sue Bedeau and Maris Bleschner. Sue is a nationally known speaker, writer, and consultant. She is a former president of the North American Council on Adoptable Children and is a current president of Justice for Families. She's also an experienced adoptive parent herself. And so, Sue, would you mind going ahead and say hi to everybody so they know your voice when you're speaking later on?
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sue. We also have Maris Bleschner. Maris is an adoptive and birth parent and a licensed clinical social worker and educator. And she's also a nationally respected trainer and speaker who co-founded and led a multi-service adoption agency for 26 years. So we're really excited to have Maris here. Maris, would you say hi to everybody so they know your voice?
Hi, this is Maris, and I'm from New York City, so you'll recognize my accent.
I love it. I love it so much. Thank you so much, everybody. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and just take us through some brief housekeeping on this. As Lucy said, she went over how to enter your questions and everything. So I'm just going to briefly go over some other pieces of this so that you'll be aware. This webinar is designed to be 90 minutes long, which does include time for your questions that you could submit via typing into the questions pod. We will be monitoring your questions. I will be monitoring them along with some other staff people here. So we have a lot of people monitoring questions, and I will voice them out loud to presenters as they come to a natural pause. So if your question isn't immediately asked, please know that we're certainly not ignoring you. We're just kind of waiting for Maris or Sue to come to a natural pause in their presentation. Please also use this functionality if you're having any technical difficulties, and we can help you with that as well. Your line will be muted throughout the course of the webinar, but we do hope that you will participate via the chat questions so that you can take advantage of the expertise of these great speakers that we have today. There are also resources available in the handouts pod that I would encourage you to download before the webinar is over. We've included a PDF of these slides in case you'd like to refer back to them later, share them with your coworkers, anything like that, as well as other Adopt US Kids publications that we thought that you might find helpful based on your interest in this event. We are recording this webinar and it will be shared with you. So the recording will also be posted on the Adopt US Kids YouTube channel and on adoptuskids.org in the professional section of that website. Finally, we would also ask that you please take a moment at the close of the webinar to evaluate the session. You will receive a separate email as the webinar closes from Adopt US Kids evaluation. We really hope that it'll take about 5 minutes after the webinar closes to evaluate it, and we greatly value participant feedback, and we regularly use this evaluation data that we receive from you to improve our future events. So thank you so much in advance for taking the time to do that. As I mentioned, it is a separate email, so sometimes that throws people off, but you will be getting a separate email from Adopt US Kids evaluation. With that, I also wanted to go over a little bit briefly before we get into the content of what Adopt US Kids is for those who are not aware. Adopt US Kids is a national project of the U.S. Children's Bureau. The project is designed to raise public awareness about the need for foster and adoptive families for children in the public child welfare system. It is also designed to assist states, territories, and tribes to recruit, engage, develop, and support foster and adoptive families. And that includes customary adoptive families, relative caregivers, permanent guardians, those folks as well. So this webinar falls into that second portion of our mission there. You may be familiar with Adopt US Kids National Adoption Recruitment Campaign with the PSAs, with the tagline, "You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent." You may also be familiar with our national photo listing, where we help to connect children in need of adoptive homes with approved families. We also have an adoption and foster care information exchange system, where we assist prospective foster and adoptive parents in starting the approval process and get them connected with the appropriate jurisdiction. Adopt US Kids also offers capacity building and engagement services to states, tribes, and territories that are in need of any system-specific assistance on any of the topics within our mission. We also have a family support team, which I'm a part of. We offer webinars like this and other resources to the field that help to guide and encourage systems to build and enhance the support services available to foster and adoptive families across the country. And last but not least, we do offer a minority Professional Leadership Development Program, and that is for current and emerging leaders of color in the adoption field. So if your state, tribe, or territory is interested in receiving any assistance from Adopt US Kids, please do reach out to us. Our contact information is at the end of this presentation. So with that, I'm going to get into the content. Thank you so much for listening to my spiel there. And I want to go over the goals of our webinar. We really want to discuss the importance of ongoing development and concurrent planning in preparing foster parents to adopt the children that are in their care. We are certainly going to also discuss the support needs of parents and also of children and teens during that very vulnerable period of transition from foster care to adoption, and how those needs may change. We want to provide you with concrete strategies, and by you we mean workers, supervisors, program managers, and any folks at your agency to better support families transitioning from foster care to adoption. And before I hand it over to Sue, I would love to see, we have a quick poll that we would like to, because there was a lot of folks registered for this, and so it really helps us to understand as we continue this presentation. We'd like to know who's in the room. So if you wouldn't mind, you can select any of these that apply to you. If you're a frontline worker working with children, if you're a frontline worker working with foster or adoptive parents, if you're a supervisor, a program manager, or other. There's only 5 categories available, so we had to pick an other. But if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to vote and share with us who you are so that we can tailor the content appropriately. I'm just going to give folks a minute here. Looks like a lot of folks are answering it, and I appreciate that. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it, and I'm going to share the results with y'all. Okay, great. It sounds like we have a lot of frontline workers, which is fabulous. A lot of the folks that are doing the work with families and children. So that's so great. And we know that this isn't going to be a cut and dry because a lot of folks selected multiple answers, so that's great. But I'd love to know if anybody is willing to share what the other referred to as you answered other. If you would type that into chat, I can voice that as we go here. But I'm gonna hide the results, and then I am gonna hand it over to Sue Bedeau to get us started on the content. Sue, go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm really excited to be here with all of you. And I wanted to say a bit more about myself. I know that as I was introduced, it was mentioned that I both have experience as a foster or adoptive parent and professionally in the field. So I just wanted to say a bit about this because this topic that we're talking about today is something I feel very personally passionate about. My husband and I started as foster parents when we were barely out of college. I hadn't even turned 21 yet when we were signing up to become foster parents. And the first children that we became foster parents to were teenagers. Over the years since then, we have fostered around 75 children of all ages, from infants to teenagers, although mostly teenagers. And we adopted 20 of them, so many of the children we adopted did come to us from a foster care placement initially. So this transition that we're here to talk about today is one that I've been through personally many times, but then also this has been my profession and worked in the field as a caseworker, working with families, approving families, doing home studies, doing training. But also I had several years where I worked with an agency where my primary role was working with birth families and helping birth families really come to terms with what it would take to be reunified with their child, and or when that wasn't going to happen, what could happen next in terms of their lifelong relationship with their child. So I've really participated in this process from multiple sides before sort of taking on this role as a trainer now is most of what I do. I'm starting out my time with you by showing you this slide and this picture of a healthy, rooted tree, because I really want to give you this picture to have in mind, and I'm going to spend about 3 or 4 more slides kind of using this metaphor, and I'll take you through why. Because I really believe that the transition to adoption, when it is the right and best and necessary permanency plan for a child, it has to begin on day one of that family's involvement with that child. And in order for that to happen, there has to be sort of a shift in how we really communicate with families, birth families, foster families, kin, adopted families, youth themselves. There has to be a shift in the way we talk about the relationships from day one. So what I'd like you to think about here as you just see this image of this tree is, have you ever seen a tree, really watched a tree during a storm? And I think either from our own life experiences or for imagery we see on the news when there's big storms, we can all relate to seeing a tree that just, that shudders and blows and then suddenly just becomes completely uprooted as a result of a storm. And then we can imagine other times when we've seen what feels like an equally powerful storm pass through an area, and trees that do again bend way to the ground and again shudder and shake. But at the end, when the storm is over, the tree, although it may have lost a branch or two, it may have lost a lot of leaves, the tree is still intact and whole. And what makes the difference between the tree that gets uprooted versus the tree that remains intact and whole? What always makes the difference is the strength of that root system. So I really want you to have that imagery in your mind, that picture in your mind, that, even those trees that suffer some kind of harm, or some might say damage from a storm, no one suggests, wow, the way to fix that then is to just, cut them off from the roots and move that tree over here without its roots. We always believe in preserving the roots and then doing what we need to do to help the tree come back to full thriving status and stature. So,
Hey Sue, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We're having we got a comment that we're getting a little bit of feedback, and there's like rustling and stuff. So would just wanted to note that for you. Sorry to stop you.
Oh, no problem. I'm glad to know the feedback, and I will try to hold my audio.
Hard.
Is that better? Does that sound better now when I'm holding it?
It does. Thank you.
All right, great. So this metaphor of the root system, I believe, is one that is helpful to use with families as we begin to sort of set that groundwork that's going to be needed for this whole idea of concurrent planning, for this whole idea that permanency is the ultimate goal that we're looking for, and that the family that starts out as a foster family is going to have some kind of role in that, some kind of role, whether it's going to be the lasting permanent role, or whether it's going to be a short-term role. That the changing of the language, the changing of the sort of way of thinking and framing and talking about it starting from day one, as I mentioned, means that we want to really have these conversations with families right from the beginning that help them see, when you first become involved with a child, from that moment forward, you're part of that child's root system. Whether or not that child is in your home one day, or you become that child's permanent family. When we really look at a tree, we don't talk about a tree having a singular root, and we don't talk about a tree having roots, plural. Some of us do, just sort of in the lingo, but usually a tree expert will say a tree having a root system. And every family and caseworker, for that matter, that touches the life of a child becomes part of that. And so it's really shifting that idea that not will I be part of this child's permanence, but how? And that's sort of a refrain that you'll hear me mention more than once in my time with you. But we know that as the placement evolves, and as the birth family works their case plan and encounters whatever various successes or challenges that they encounter, we know that things are going to change, and there's going to be some unexpected changes, and there's going to be some unplanned expectations on the family, on the foster family, that grow out of those changes. So my goal with sharing this metaphor is that it keeps the central focus on the needs of the child and on helping the child stay healthy and whole and maintain the connections that are necessary for their well-being. So as we use that approach as a way to engage in conversations with families, some of the things that we can ask them to consider sort of are, what do they see as the characteristics of a strong root system in the life of a tree, and how do they translate that into the life of a child? What does a strong root system do? And what can our role be in strengthening that child's root system, even if there's sort of this transplant going on that the child, came from the birth family, is now in the home of a foster family who may then, who is going to be part of that child's permanence one way or another, and may ultimately become the adoptive family. What can the worker do to have these conversations? And there's a couple of things I want to suggest here. And one is that, I use metaphors and then I sometimes mix metaphors, so I hope that's not confusing. But one of the things I sometimes talk about with families when in my role as a caseworker has been to ask them to think about times when you're just traveling, going on a road trip, when you're setting out to head to a particular destination. But what if along the way there becomes a detour, there's a barrier, there's a roadblock, there's bad weather, there's traffic, something that makes you have to go through a different kind of twist and turn. And this is a conversation that a worker can have with family and help them see that when you face that kind of circumstance, you then have the option of kind of sitting in that traffic or that detour and stewing about it and being mad, or even just giving up and turning back. Or you can look around where you are and you can say, wait a minute, how can we make where we are now still part of this wonderful journey that we're on? How can we make the best, not just the best of it, but how can we really get something useful and meaningful out of it? So that's one of the ways that I encourage workers to begin having those kinds of conversations with families right from day one. And as they do, just really helping them understand that every child's root system has to be complex, that root systems by nature they're deep and they're vast and they are complex, and they have stronger and more fragile roots that sort of support and help each other. And so that this journey that they're entering into with this child that they don't know yet if this child is going to be in their home, for days or weeks or months or forever, that it is a complex journey, and that at different times their role might be called upon to be different. Now, I've been talking so far with workers with you about how to talk with families, and I'm going to say more about that as I go on as well, and I know Maris will really expound on that as well. But I want to pause here for a moment and especially talk about the important role of the caseworker as being part of that actual root system of that child as well. And not just the root system of the child, but the root system of this family. And that in order for the family to really open up and be willing to have these hard conversations about these sort of being in this limbo territory, about being able to work towards reunification and possibly committing to adoption at the same time, and all the other things that we will continue to explore throughout this webinar, if the family is going to really have that kind of conversation with the worker and really put their full and best self into embarking on that journey, there has to be a trust there. The worker really has to be a core, strong part of the root system that the family can trust. There has to be open communication, mutual trust and respect. I was working recently consulting on a case that involved a family, a foster family that was asked to receive placement of a sibling group of 3 children. And in this particular foster family, they had really stellar, they were well loved within the agency because they had done a really good job, and they really understood a lot about being foster parents. And that was because one of the foster parents had grown up in care as well. That was one of the reasons. That was one of the things really valuable about this family. But the other side of that was that this parent who had grown up in care had some bad prior relationships with caseworkers and didn't have a real trusting relationship with caseworkers. And this new caseworker for the 3 children especially kind of seemed to embody some of those characteristics that this foster parent didn't trust. And so it got off on a bad foot, and there just wasn't trust between this caseworker and this foster family. And then things were going along pretty well until they weren't, until there was challenges, until there was behaviors. And we'll certainly be talking a little more about that in a few minutes, the kinds of behaviors that often happen right on the cusp of this transition period into adoption. But when that started to happen, because neither the family nor the worker had really taken the time to invest in their own relationship with each other, and although they both have a responsibility in that, I really want to emphasize it is the worker. That's your job. That's our job as a worker, to step back and say, am I investing in this relationship not just with the child, but with the adults? Am I making sure that there is this trust here so that they can talk to me and come to me? And in the case that I was just describing to you, because that trust hadn't really been built, when things got really rocky and started to break down, the foster family kind of shut down, and then they weren't willing to go forward with the adoption. And it was really a very, very painful situation for everyone involved. So when we talk about this idea of the root system being vast and complex, part of the complexity is that those relationships with helping professionals, including the caseworker, supervisor, guardian ad litem, lots of people that are going to be involved, they have to see, each of themselves have to see their role in this whole picture as well. So this is going to be the last slide where I'm really going to dwell on this metaphor of the root system, but I just wanted to take one more moment here to use it to help us think about the different ways that we have conversations with families about how and why their role in leading to permanence for the child, however that permanency ends up happening, even early on, even when they're still not sure, even when they're still, shooting for reunification and hoping that it will happen and then it later may change. How do they really understand the role they're still playing, even in those early days, even in those uncertain days, related to permanency? And so the 4 pictures that you see on this slide here are pictures all taken of a tree in my yard of the home we raised our children in. It was what I called my favorite tree. And I would step out of my front door almost every day and just look at that tree and go, I just loved how beautiful and spectacular it looked in every single season of the year. And so that really got me to thinking that the roots are playing a role every season of the year, whether you can sort of see it or not. And the roots are doing the kinds of things that are described in the bullets here. They're absorbing the nutrients from the ground and from the rain and from everything else. They're screening out toxins. They're storing up what the tree is going to need to survive the winter. They're being that anchor from those storms that we talked about earlier. Now, all of those things happen because the roots are there in the life of a tree, and all of those things happen when the roots of permanency are there in the life of a child. If there's not permanence for a child, they can have nutrients around them. They can be housed, they can be clothed, they can be fed, but they're not really absorbing those nutrients. We know about stories of failure to thrive. We know about stories of children whose actual physical growth is stunted when they're not living with a family that's permanent for them. And we certainly know about the impact of trauma and those toxins. It takes this real concerted effort to have permanence in the life of a child, even in those so-called winter times, even when it looks dark and when it looks like no new growth is really happening. It takes everyone's focus on creating those roots that are really permanent to help the child really grow and thrive. And so that's why everyone involved in the life of the child has to be focused on permanence. And again, I'm using phrases and language with you here that I hope you could pick up on and use those same kind of phrases and that same kind of language with families as you talk to them about these things. I want to share one story here that really illustrates all of this. It's a story that has to do with the son of a close friend of mine, and in this story, she's the birth parent of a child who ultimately was adopted. But when he was in foster care, and then later when he was adopted, the adoptive parent, the foster parent, and the birth parent, they had a respectful relationship. They had communication. They talked about each other favorably to the child. And there came a time when the child was 16 and he was out with some friends, and they were in a mall, and they were walking around and having a good time, when they started to feel concerned, frightened, scared. They felt like they were being followed, and they were worried and didn't know what to do. So he called his mother. Now, when I say he called his mother, just to be clear, he called his adoptive mother. He called the mother who had raised him, the person he was connected to, as his mother. He called her and expressed, "I'm concerned, I'm worried. What should I do?" But because there had been this long-standing and ongoing and sort of concurrently planned, if you will, working relationship between the birth parent and the foster parent who became the adoptive parent, when she was on the phone with her son, she recognized where he was physically, where his location was, and she knew that he could walk over to where his birth mother was quicker than she could ever get to him, come pick him up or anything. So the adoptive mother, suggested, "Why don't you go hang out with your birth mother until I can get there to pick you up?" And I just love this story because it illustrates the outcome we would be hoping for and looking for. In many instances, if we can make this smooth and successful transition, it's where it's seamless for the child. It's where, in spite of the trauma, in spite of the challenges, there's still this sense that everyone in my life is pulling for me and everyone's part of my permanency. Okay, trying to get the slide to click. So to my support team on the webinar, I'm trying to click to the next slide. It's not going. Thank you. So if we want to get to those kind of outcomes, if we want to get to the point of a child who in their teen years or their adult years feels secure, again, as I said earlier, we need this to start from day one. And so we need to think about this idea of concurrent planning a little differently than we have maybe thought about it before. And what I mean by differently is we often think of concurrent planning, we often even talk about concurrent planning as if it was two separate goals. Oh, we can go back to that slide that we were just on. We often, the slides are having a mind of their own now, I apologize. We often talk about concurrent planning as if it's two separate goals. And, but what we want to think about is that it's really one goal, and that right from the very beginning, the time in foster care should be aimed at supporting this goal of permanence. So as we look at the statistics and the numbers, what we see is that most children, unfortunately, there are still a lot of children who age out of foster care, but most children do exit from foster care to one form of permanence, particularly among the big three: reunification, adoption, or guardianship. So the success of that ultimate permanence, a lot of it does rest on the work that the initial foster parent does, and that any foster parent in the life of that child plays. That child is, if you think about it from day one, that this child is going to end up in a permanent home, and I'm going to play an important role towards that. Then that again helps frame the kinds of conversations we have with the foster parents. And another way to think about having those conversations is to begin asking foster parents to think about, if permanence goes as we're planning, if this goal of reunification occurs, what do you think will be the best part about that? Why do you think that'll be good? What would be the best thing for the child? What will you take away from it that's good? How will you feel good about that if that happens? But also asking, what will be the hardest part about that? What do you think will be hardest for the child? What will be hardest for you? And similarly, having that same conversation around alternative outcomes. Well, what if reunification doesn't happen? What if we have to, consider that this child could be your child permanently, that you have to switch gears, that we're going to move towards adoption? What will be hardest for you in making that transition? And what will be best? What will be hardest for the child? And what will be best? So really having those kind of conversations very early. Now let's see if we can go to the next slide. Okay, it's not going to the next slide, but I'm going to start talking about it anyway. In this way that I was just discussing, we can begin preparing families to actively support reunification at the same time that they could actively consider the possibility of adoption. And one way, as a caseworker, we can try to help families with that is to normalize it as much as possible. So what do I mean by normalizing it? We really want to help families think about other ways in which they have shifting or changing relationships with people in their life. Other ways that they have maybe a primary role and then maybe a secondary role, or maybe a secondary role that later becomes a primary role. So, for example, the times when there's step families, when there's divorce, and then there's step families. That's an example that families can relate to of. Not all families, but some families can relate to, of sort of this shifting of relationships. There's also when we're in our family and we grow up and we live with them, but then we move away. But then maybe later in life we move our adult parents back in to live with us, or we have to decide that they need to go in a nursing home, but we're still involved in their life. So any of the ways that we can talk about these more normalized life situations in which our relationship with a person stays steadfast, it stays permanent. There's still commitment there, there's still love there, there's still care there, but our role might change. And so that's really part of the whole concurrent planning conversation that workers can have with families, is to help normalize what can seem very scary when they're having these shifting or uncertain or unclear roles in the lives of children. Yay, it clicked. All right, we're back on track here. So to reiterate, what I've been sharing is that we want to help families see that it's not about having two separate goals, a goal of reunification or a goal of adoption, but one goal, which is permanence, and that how that looks, the path to that role may be what changes, but the ultimate role is going to stay the same. So another important conversation to have with families is, what do I envision my role being a year from now with this child? What do I envision my role being 5 years from now? What if this child is no longer with me a year from now or 5 years from now, and they've returned to their birth family? What role might I still play in their life? Is it possible I become a mentor in their reunification? Is it possible I still provide respite? What if that can't happen? What if that doesn't happen? Well, what if I'm expecting that to happen, and then the reunification doesn't happen, and I'm right now playing this temporary role, but I need to then become the permanent parent for this child. I need to switch gears and adopt. How would that change what my role could look like a year from now? How would that change what my role could look like 5 years from now? And really do creative strategies. Don't only use life books, but do life books sort of are about the past, right? We put our scrapbooks and things where we put together what's happened in my life so far, but use a sort of prospective approach to that. Help families and youth. This is something you can really do with youth. Make a vision board or a vision book. What do I think my life will be like? What kinds of supports is this child going to need, and how can I be part of that? So the more of these conversations that we can have that sort of, again, normalize all the possibilities and help everyone see that they won't have to completely cut off themselves from one another, but rather have changing roles in each other's lives.
Hey, Sue, if you're at a stopping point, I actually have a question come in.
Sure.
So the question was, how do you keep foster parents, maybe those who may be more focused on adoption, from focusing on that possibility of adoption without sabotaging reunification? Do you have any advice on that?
Great question, and it kind of relates a little bit to where we're going with this next slide, so it's perfect timing for it. But it also relates back to that initial image of the strong tree, and that is when you're communicating with families, even if they've either expressed or you just have a sense that their primary role and goal is that they want to see themselves as adoptive parents, you have to keep centering it back to the child, bringing the focus back to the child, reminding them that if they accomplish their goal of becoming adoptive parents in ways that ultimately did sabotage other relationships or other connections for the child, that may mean that the child won't be strong and healthy. And that may mean that their ultimate adoption, even if they feel they reached their goal, won't be as successful for everyone involved. So if they really want what's best for this child, then they need to fully invest at every step along the way, saying, how can I center and focus on what's best for this child? How can I learn what that means? Take more classes, talk to more people, read more books, and understand that lasting connections, including sort of the repair of connections that might have been harmed or broken through life circumstances and trauma, which is what this slide is about, really ultimately is going to be in the best interest. And if the adoption does come about after that, and you've really invested yourself well, even in that birth family relationship, even in that potential of reunification, then when you do get to adoption, it's going to be stronger. The adoption is going to be stronger, and the child is going to be healthier, and their well-being is going to be more secure. So it's really just always bringing that conversation back to, what does this child need, not just now, but in the future? How is this going to play out for the child, not just tomorrow, but next year? What questions might they have for you, not only today, but 5 years from now, and how will you be able to respond to those? So I think that's sort of the approach to take. And so hopefully that's helpful as it really does focus, and as we look back to what I'm hitting on here, is that although permanence is always what the child needs, because of trauma, and particularly the kinds of complex trauma that most of the children in our foster care system have experienced, complex trauma that's been a result of not just one type of abuse or neglect, but multiple instances and situations and relationships that were broken, attachments, that these things had an impact on their development. Sometimes that looks like developmental delays, sometimes not. So that's why I don't use the word delayed development here, but that attachments are impacted and development is impacted when trauma occurs. And how we see this play out is in behavior. And I'm almost about to wrap up my portion, and in just a couple of moments turn it over to Maris, and I know she's going to talk a lot more about this. But I wanted to kind of kick that part of it off, and that what we're going to see, particularly as we get closer to that possible transition, as we get closer to things looking like adoption could be the permanency path for a particular child, trauma comes out in the form of behavior. Behavior is the language of trauma. And yet, when everyone is focused on the behavior, when everyone from the caseworker to the foster/adoptive family to the therapist to the judge is focused on behavior, often the approaches that we try to take to address behavior, instead of bolstering and supporting permanence, and those connections, which are ultimately the only things that are going to heal that trauma, often behavior itself is something that drives all of us in directions away from permanence. And so recommendations are made that a child needs a certain treatment or a certain move, a certain different placement to correct this behavior. And so we have to be strong and we have to be consistent in our message with families that normalizes this, that helps them understand these behaviors are to be expected. I do a whole day-long workshop on trauma, and I often spend quite a bit of time on this idea that when parents are going through the hard times, the dark, difficult days, those times when the child is out of control in their behavior, when you're getting a lot of calls from the school, when there's punching a hole in the wall, when they're doing things that make you feel at wit's end or make you feel as a parent that you can't keep the child even possibly safe. When these things are happening, one of the things that as workers we have to do is help parents see, you know what, this is really part of the journey. This is normal. And sometimes when I say that, people say, well, that's not very reassuring. That's not going to make people want to stick with it and hang in there. But actually it does. Actually it does, because there's nothing more lonely and isolating than to be in that foster, soon to be adoptive parent shoes of thinking, oh, no one gets what I'm going through. I'm so alone in this and I can't do it. But if we can give them the message that, yes, this is normal and that there's help and there's hope. If we combine those two messages, and that also not only can you do this, but you're exactly the right person to do this. That no matter what else you have for any kinds of credentials, what this child needs most is that permanency, that consistency in the relationship that you are the one that can provide. So as those behavior needs change, as the child actually is beginning to heal, and in that beginning of healing, the behaviors often get worse, that's when we as workers really need to be even more consistent in those messages. And so as we work with families, even after the pre-service training has ended, even after those sort of initial visits where we were doing a lot of that educating have ended, and we're kind of moving into that part of the placement where, maybe we have really come to a place where it looks like reunification is not going to happen, and we've had conversations about adoption. Even when we get into those times, those maybe seemingly quieter times in terms of the role of the caseworker with the family, we have to recognize that those times that seem a little quieter from a casework perspective can be very challenging and very hard for families. And so we have to really use every single interaction we have with the family to reinforce all these messages that have gone before. And this is where I particularly ask people to think about how you use visits. And when I'm speaking of visits here, I'm speaking of visits that between the foster parent and the caseworker, between the child and the caseworker, between the child and the birth family, if those are still happening, between the child and siblings that they may have been separated from. But any of the visits that are going on, this is when we have to be very intentional about using every moment and every interaction during those visits to help support conversations about permanency and do activities that support permanency. There's a really great type of visitation program called family time visitation that is used in some states. And if it's not the one that you use in your state, I strongly encourage you to at least take a look at it, because it really gives guidance about how to work with both the birth family and the foster and pre-adoptive family to really use visits in a way that's intentional and that helps them to continue to reframe these questions about what role will we each continue to play as this permanency journey continues to unfold.
Hey, Sue, if you are at a stopping point, I have a question for you. It's actually several questions, which is why I do want to mention here that we have a lot of questions. It's a really large group, which is awesome and fabulous. And I think that it's certainly wouldn't be too far off to say that there's so much to cover here. There's so much need in all of these areas that we're frankly not going to be able to get to in 90 minutes. We are keeping record of all of the questions that have come in, and if they don't necessarily fit within the context of this webinar, I can follow up with you after the webinar and share some resources with you to help with that specific question. But Sue, I did want to ask this one question on how do you balance, or if you have advice on balancing preparing parents for behaviors for those challenges and not scaring them away before they've even started, before they've even gotten into the process.
Sure, that's a great question, and I definitely will respond to it. And then I'm going to I have like 2 slides left. I'm going to go through them really quickly because I do want to hand it off to Maris in about the next 1 to 2 minutes.
Absolutely.
But really, the answer to that question, these questions are just so cool, the way they're coming, the timing, because that question really is answered by this slide in a lot of ways. It's that the key is engagement. We really need to engage with and partner with families. And so I know when we were initially planning this and I wrote the words on this slide, I had the provide information and the consult with in quotes. And at one point, somehow the quotes came out and I said, no, we got to put them back in. Here's the reason. You see, a lot of times what we think we're doing as caseworkers is we're providing the information that the family needs. That can scare people away, or that can turn people off, or that can shut people down, or that can just bore people, frankly. But it's when we actively consult with and engage with and partner with families around permanency decisions that same material, that same content, that same information then becomes empowering, and it becomes useful information that they can then use to base how they gather resources, how they use their own extended family, and things like that. I liken it really to those early times of people who are having a child by birth. You go to pregnant couples go to classes, preparation classes for childbirth, and they learn things. And in those classes, no one's the teachers of those classes behind the scenes, they don't say, I don't think we're going to tell these families that labor is painful. I don't think we're going to tell these families that babies don't sleep through the night. I don't think we're going to tell them about colic, because we just don't want to scare people away and they're just going to abandon their children or something. No, you tell them about all those things, and then you help equip them for how to be capable to manage those things when they occur. And so in the same way, that's the way that we want to do it with families, is really have a vision of the families as our peers in the team that's working towards permanence for the child. And so therefore consult with and partner with and talk to them about, okay, when these things happen, what do you think will be most helpful? When you've had challenges in the past, what supports worked for you? And really approach it that way rather than here, I'm just providing you this information. So if I can go to my last slide here and just remind us that in addition to consulting and partnering with families, we have to also engage the children and the youth in planning their own lives. And yet we can't do that in a way that just simply says to the child, so what do you want? Or do you want to be adopted? And the child says no. And we say, okay, that's it. We really have to go into more about, you've heard of workshops and things that describe it as unpacking the no, exploring what's behind the no, exploring what's behind the trauma and the backstory, and really working with young people to sort of stretch their own ability to set goals, help them set, well, what's your goal for next week? What's your goal for this semester? As we build towards having conversations about what's your goal for your life, and how does having a family, how does having parents, how does having permanency fit in with your own life goals? So part of making this work and this transition happen smoothly and successfully, even in spite of the challenges that occur, is really engaging both the parents and the child. And so on that note, I would love to have Maris pick up from here.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just go, let's see if the slides work. No. Okay, we need to take, oh, all right, we're going too far forward. Give us a minute. So give me 1 minute and we can do, okay. My name is Maris Bleschner, and I guess I have been in the child welfare field forever. I was the executive director. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I was the executive director of a special needs or multi type of child adoption agency for many years, but that places all different kinds of children. But before that, my husband and I adopted 2 children. We had a birth child. We did a little informal foster care, watching after kids. But what I was when my children were young was I was a community activist helping foster parents. I was part of a foster children's rights organization that sprung up in New York. And in helping foster parents, I saw a whole other side of the world of adoption, or not adoption, just child welfare. And I figure I have seen, that's why I'm very comfortable doing this kind of a workshop, because I have seen a lot of the different sides of the foster care and adoption world. The other thing I need to tell you is I am a very practical person. So I want to talk to you in a practical kind of way. I thought, what is more practical than, and these are the words I give you are words that I would give foster parents too. That instead of a child having to move again when they can't go home, when there's no family to go back to, it is so much better for them to be adopted by the foster parent who's been taking care of them. The issue of not just of that, as I always think of Halloween, where they know the lady down the block who makes cookies, and they know where to ride their bike, and they know the dog across the street. When a child moves, they lose everything again, even if they, oh, I'm sorry, that's my phone. Anyway, the other piece, the biggest piece of that is not just losing where they are, but the likelihood of maintaining birth family connections is better for them. It's a greater likelihood, and it's really, really important. This slide is like a slide of truth. Kids should not have to move again. And there are publications about this, helping foster families. There's the whole series of things that you could look at. There are books, because this is a truth that we live with. But the thing is, in this practicality, is that a foster family sometimes transitions to adoption long before you think they are. Sometimes I think that the first time they see a cute little kid and their sister-in-law says to them, "Oh, you're going to adopt this one?" way before anything happens, the week that a child moves into the house. So foster parents have the word in their head long before you realize that they do. So foster parent training has to be adoption training. It can't be just foster parent training. I mean, the other piece of it is that families love their foster children way, way before the issue of adoption comes up. And I think we need to recognize that and what do we by recognize what I mean? We have to say all this stuff out loud. There are things that aren't said out loud that I guess I really believe need to be said out loud. We could do a whole workshop on just the things that aren't said out loud that need to be said out loud. The other piece of that goes along with it is that if a foster parent now gets to adopt a child that they've been parenting for many years, there is an assumption, and we do it too. We who are professionals in the field have this assumption too, that, oh, it's fine. Mrs. Smith is going to adopt Jimmy. She's been his foster mother for 7 years. It's no big deal. It won't be any different to move from foster parenting to adopting the same child. And the reality is that it's very different. The psychological dynamic, the legal part, social things, the foster family's own family, and foster parents need help from the beginning to understand that it's going to be different. There really shouldn't be foster parent training and then, pre-adoptive parent training, then adoptive parent training. It really is a continuum, and these things need to be said sometimes at the very beginning. Certainly the things foster parents get at the very beginning, but Sue and I was talking about ages and stages, how your child is growing up and how the losses they've had in their lives may affect each stage of child development. foster parents moving to adoption need to go back, even 7 years later, need to go back and take a look at that again from the perspective of this child now feeling safe, which is what happens. When you finally, a foster parent finally comes to the point of signing paperwork and saying to this child, yes, we're really going to adopt you, that child starts to feel safe when they have never really felt safe before. And before I leave this slide, I have to say to you, plus, how do we explain the significance of adoption in a society that doesn't value adoption? We who fight to get kids adopted well know that our neighbors in the mall don't understand adoption the way we do and don't value it the way we do. So there's a training. I ran an agency for 26 years, and before that, I ran a special needs program at a foster care agency. And in the training, all these years from the very beginning, I've always done training on how do you understand adoption? How do you help someone see what adoption is? And I start by saying what adoption is not. I give this to you guys. I've been doing it for a million years, and I know they're doing it in a lot of places. It's yours. You know, you absolutely can use this. It makes sense to people. Adoption is not when you go to court. That's the finalization. The adoption itself happened long before that. And if you ask a caseworker, what is adoption? They'll say to you, oh my God, it's all the paperwork. And the truth is, there's a huge amount of paperwork just to get one kid adopted. And by the time that huge batch of papers gets to court, something is outdated already and has to be done over anyway. It's following the rules. And the other thing is there's no mutuality. I had a friend who used to do a workshop on how adoption is like marriage. Adoption is nothing like marriage. We hope that marriage is a mutual decision and a mutual power relationship between equals. That's what a good marriage is. But adoption is absolutely nothing like that, because who has all the power? How much power does a child have in adoption? None. Zero. Think about it. In our world, adults lead, children follow. Adults initiate and commit, and children respond and allow themselves to be adopted. Kids are not adopting the adults. Adults adopt and children are adopted. Parents claim their children and their children allow themselves to be claimed. What we teach our families who come in is that who goes first? An adult always goes first. An adult decides to do this, and then a child allows it to happen. And the truth of the matter is, if you have other kids in the family, they're going to watch and see what their parents do. And the kids being adopted will follow the lead of their new parents. There's no issue. Children change when they're adopted. You know that. They grow and they gain weight and they look better. But you know who changes more? The adoptive parents change more in becoming adoptive parents. So how do you know then? Just a side issue. How do you know then who's going to be a good adoptive parent? Someone with the ability to grow and change will be a good adoptive parent. And I should also tell you that adults go first in adoption and adults go first in disruption too. No kid ever started a disruption. A disruption happens when an adult says, you know what, I can't do it anymore, I'm done. So if that's what adoption is not, let me tell you what adoption is. Adoption is such a simple thing. It's not at all what you think it is. It's a decision. If there's one adult makes that decision. If it's a partnership and there are two adults, the two adults each make their own decision. It's a decision that's made by an adult and accepted by a child. And this is, I would say to you, that this is the core truth of our adoption universe. Adoption is an emotional claim that you make. One person says, you are my kid, and that's it. And that claim, you can't go back on. It is forever. It is permanent, it is irrevocable, and it is unconditional. In a world, I would point out to you, where very little is permanent, irrevocable, or unconditional. There are conditions on everything. I mean, you can't change your race. You can't change your culture. And there's something in the eye. We'll be able to, at airports, they're going to be able to know us by our iris. But the only thing that's unconditional, people say in our training, they say, well, a dog's love is unconditional. But other than that, we live in a pretty conditional world, not adoption. Whether this is a brand new parent or what are we talking about? We're talking about foster parents who've had a child with them for 6 years, 4 years, 10 years, who knows? They claim this child, and all adoptive parents know this, that the claim that an adoptive parents make is just like birth claim. Adoption is a life cycle event, like birth. And what it is, it says, and I have both kinds of kids, so I can speak from experience. A woman is pregnant, feels her baby move, and she says, oh, a baby is moving inside of me. And then in one instant, she changes. She doesn't say a baby. She says my baby, and that's a birth parent's claim. Men, maybe sometimes they're in the delivery room, they catch the baby, or they cut the cord, or they hold the baby, or they wait till the baby says da, or whatever. Men absolutely, I have sons, men absolutely claim their babies too. But what adoptive parents know is that our claim to our children, even if it's a foster kid we've had for 11 years, is just as strong and valid as birth claim. It is there's no stronger experience in the world. And so that's what adoption is. So if you have someone coming to your office who doesn't know anything about adoption, a foster parent who says, well, will I ever get to adopt any of these kids? You have to first talk about what adoption is. It's a very simple thing. It's a straightforward, it's not intellectual. It is an emotional claim, and it's forever. The problem is, you can't go back on it, or it's not adoption. The problem is that no one ever explains this to the kids or the foster parents. And the other problem, and which they need to, and the other problem is that foster parents claim their kids sometimes before the kids are free. And that's a danger, and that has to be absolutely spoken to out loud, because it is a very, very serious thing. A foster parent loves her kids, and we know her claim, but we can't recognize it yet. But you have to explain this at the beginning. All right, so if we're going to talk practically, then we need to look at things people are afraid of. I'm going to go backwards. Let's start with the parents first. In this middle place of transitioning from being a foster parent for 4 years to now moving into adoption because the kids are free and you sign the papers and you're getting subsidy and the kids are in agreement and it's all fine, there are a lot of fears. And we're talking about practical realities here. I mean, certainly if someone is parenting a handicapped child where they've gotten a tremendous amount of assistance from their agency in fighting for resources and getting the best school, all the different things that we are needed for as an agency, parents worry once the adoption is finalized, who's going to help them. They also worry sometimes that maybe they're not doing the right thing. I will tell you this, and this I know from many foster parents, sometimes your own family, when you're a foster parent thinking about adopting, says, you really want to adopt that kid? Why don't you just be a foster parent? I mean, you knew that kid's parents. Do you really want to do this? Foster parents have told me any number of times that their extended family is not always supportive. And that what they're told is they're being selfish. So foster parents worry about that, and that they will have to make a lot of decisions. So look at the responsibility that we have as agency people. All of us who work in agencies have to be sure that we know what post-adoption services are in the area. These things change. There's funding that comes and goes. Parent support groups, every family should be part of a parent support group. So that's an aside. I'll send you home with homework. Are you aware, and we have people in this webinar from all over the country and Canada, are you aware of the best support resources for families after finalization that exist? Or can you help make some? There was a time when every agency had a foster parent support group. I don't know how this is these days, because if it's two parents, people work, they don't have time. There's a lot of pressures on families, but I certainly would say that we have responsibilities as agency people to know every bit of support for our families in our community. Now let's look at the kids. The kids are worried. I mean, the biggest thing is the guilt. They're worried that they're shifting their loyalty. Now, it's true they've called this foster parent Ma for 8 years, but nevertheless, they still worry that they're giving somebody up, that they're going to lose their cousins, they're going to not see their grandma anymore. Who should they be loyal to? This is not just, 7-year-olds and 9-year-olds, 14-year-olds. They're all afraid of this kind of stuff. And change is scary. So we who are workers and therapists and supervisors, we have a big responsibility. We have to talk to kids about all of this stuff. And we have to help the foster parents talk about it as well. It's really, really hard. It's that root system thing. Use Sue's tree. I love it. And all the roots, by all means, use that. I mean, I need to tell you that in my work, where we have placed older foster children moving into adoption from a group home, from an institution, from a foster home that can't adopt, and they're moving to be adopted by a new family, what we have been telling them, because of this guilt stuff and the competing loyalties, is that there's actually room in the human heart for more than one mother or father. Don't we all carry with us people we haven't seen in a long time, people we loved who died? The heart has lots and lots of room in it. We say to kids, look them right in the eye and say to them, you do not have to push your birth mother out to allow this adoptive mother in. There's room for everybody. It's a really, really important thing. The other thing, probably, that of all the things I'm talking about, the thing that's the most important is this issue of behavioral challenges. There is a phenomenon that we know all the way across this country, that it's acknowledged everywhere, that kids are in foster care and they get finally to be moving into adoption from this in this family they know for so many years, and all of a sudden they act out when they were never kids that acted out before, which causes the foster parent to say, wait a minute, maybe this kid does not want to be adopted here, when in point of fact, it is absolutely the opposite of that. What looks and feels terrible, some kid doing all this acting out at a time you're ready to finalize your adoption, is actually a child communicating their deepest feelings. It has a name. It's called inducement. It's a psychological phenomenon that we're all part of. It's where people make other people feel the way they feel without even using any words. If you have a friend who's having a bad divorce and she sits in your house and she drinks coffee and she tells you what a terrible time she's having, she leaves and you holler at your husband because that person made you feel the way they feel too. We believe very strongly, lots of us in the field, that kids in the foster care system who've had all of this trouble and trauma and sorrow and feelings of abandonment have a lot of sadness and anger and frustration and you name it inside of them. But they don't let it out. Because if they let it out, because kids don't talk to you, they act out. If they let it out, the foster parents wouldn't keep them. So they keep all these negative feelings buried deep inside them, like in a locked box, until they feel safe. When do they feel safe? When they acknowledge that the foster parent is really adopting them, that this is going to be a forever family. They never have to move again, and now they could relax. Well, guess what? What do? How do you heal if you have a body filled with negative feelings? What you do is you let them out. Mostly on the mother, I would tell you. If there's a mother in a family, it is very likely that the mother will have the acting out against her more than the father in many, many families. But then they say, well, wait a minute, what is this kid doing? The answer is this kid is communicating with you. This kid feels safe enough to heal. It is healing. So what looks and feels terrible is a wonderful thing. It is healing. And we tell our families, the better a family you are, the better your child will heal and the more difficult it will be for you. I mean, this is a very, very serious thing because people don't adopt. Foster parents who are absolutely going to adopt don't adopt because of the inducement, because the kids feel terrible. They're letting their parents feel the way they feel. So kids will say, this kid makes me angrier than I've ever felt in my life. I never felt like this before. What is with this kid? I'm so upset. Maybe I'm doing the wrong thing. Maybe I'm not a good parent. And that's all. The kid's not doing it on purpose. That kid is doing it unconsciously, healing because they're communicating their feelings and they finally feel safe. But somebody has got to do a training about this. And people don't usually do it. It's so important. You need to train about it. You need to talk about trauma. Foster parents who've been, had all this training, they need to look again. What does trauma do to a child and how do you help them get past it? And the other thing is, we who are helping professionals have to be careful too, because we have this thing called vicarious trauma. We too can feel badly when we take care of people who feel badly. And that's, the issue that we need to look at here. Now, we're being realistic, right? So let's talk a little bit. I'm almost done. Let's talk a little bit about what do we do? How can we support these terrific foster families? Or maybe we don't like them. It doesn't matter. How are we going to support these families so a child can stay there? They can transition to adoption. Well, there's a lot of different ways to do it. First of all, every agency needs to identify its gifted staff and its gifted families. There are people who work at an agency. There are families who are foster families, adoptive families at an agency who have gifts, who can train other people, who can talk to other people, who can be peer support. Older kids who've been adopted should be, maybe they would want to talk to youth who's waiting to be adopted or who's in the middle of the process to show them that it's okay. Other people have done that too. We need liaisons, people to help our families navigate through the system. Find your gifted staff and use them. Find your gifted parents and use them as well. It's really important to do this. Plus, there's respite care happening around the country. Foster parents need that. They're grateful for it. There are camps and retreats in different places. Illinois does some stuff. Asheville, North Carolina does some stuff. And then there are these things called adoption ceremonies, which are just wonderful. It's not a party at finalization. It's a getting together when the adoptive family, the foster family is adopting, signs whatever papers they need to sign. It's always some kind of an adoption agreement, subsidy agreement, whatever it is. And you make a little ceremony about it. At our agency, we write a little paper. We actually, if looking at what to call it, we call it a covenant, which is a very, Old Testament word, and we are not a religious agency, but a covenant is a vow. And so we write a statement that each of the adopting parents, the foster parent, signs, stating that they claim this child, and then the child signs a statement that they agree to be adopted. Short, small, incredibly emotional. I think that the agency I was with, Family Focused Adoption Services, has it on their website. Feel free to take a look as well. Okay, so now we have to talk about us, about the workers. What are we going to do? Well, Sue said it already. What comes first? Trust. We as workers, they have to trust us. How do you make people trust you? How do you make foster parents trust you? How do you make children trust you? By being honest, by being straightforward, by talking truth, by assuming that they're worried. Each meeting that you go to with a family should have a theme of some kind, should talk about something that month. The truth is, we could do a whole 2-hour workshop on how to talk to kids and families about tough stuff. It's called Straight Talk. How to talk to kids about difficult topics. There is a wonderful book by Jane Schooler and Betsy Kiefer called Telling the Truth to Your Foster or Adopted Child that I would recommend to you, among many other books. Claudia Jewett had a book too. How do you talk to kids? This is a big, big deal. And it's not so easy. It's a skill that we have to learn and keep honed as well. And if you've got somebody gifted at your agency, make them the talker too. I mean, if you think about it, this is as big a transition as any other major life event. What do we do when there's a birth or a death? We cry. We acknowledge feelings that rise to the surface. We eat in some religions, we eat. In other religions, we sit together and we talk. Well, adoption is as big a transition as the other major life events: birth, death, marriage. Just something to think about, that we need to practice how to talk to our families. And now
Hey,
we
Maris, I'm so sorry. We have so many questions
I know I have one
for
more
you.
one more
Okay,
thing.
you go ahead, and we'll you go
Hang it
ahead.
on, yeah, because it's the end. Let me just finish, because I'm on a roll here. Because if we're going to talk about families and workers, we have to talk about our poor administrators. We have to talk. What is the administrator's responsibility? This is a reminder, this page, of how important the administrator's role is. Administrators do a lot. I was an administrator. They do a lot of stuff. They can't do the day to day. They trust supervisors do the day to day. But the truth of the matter is that administrators have an incredibly, incredibly important job. Look at the word training. The word training is all over all these slides. It is the administrator who has to make sure that this training of staff and this training of families and training of children all has to happen. You can't assume that people know how to talk to kids. You can't assume that the person doing your first information meeting, what you call pre-service, is giving the same message as everybody else. And the other thing is, you can't assume that everybody believes in this work. We all know that there are people in foster care and adoption work who really don't believe in the philosophies that we are espousing here. So it is the poor administrator who has to check on the staff training, who should have staff visit each other's families. That's a really important thing. Use your most experienced staff to go on a visit and show someone else, how to have a difficult conversation. And this issue of peer support. It is the administrator's responsibility to find foster parents and older foster kids who will help with all this training. So this is how I'm going to end. At our agency, I was taught by someone else that what we do today, you have to have a 40-year perspective. How you deal with an 8-year-old tomorrow morning will have an effect when that child is 48. This is really, really important stuff. And it's more than that. We have to all believe. Intentionality is we have to believe in what we're doing. I would end this by saying to you that the word training kept popping up all along because of a good reason. The work that we do, foster parent or worker or supervisor or administrator or therapist, is a specialty within child welfare. We and the foster parents are specialists, and we need the best training available on an ongoing basis. And people have to recognize how important the work is that we do. And I am turning this back to Britt.
Awesome. So there is so much information to go over here, so many things. So what I would like to do is I have several questions that are pending for both Maris and Sue. And what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to run through the last bit of housekeeping so that we can spend the last 10 minutes solely focused on questions. So this is where I'm going to remind everybody to please take a moment to evaluate this session. You will receive an email from Adopt US Kids evaluation. It should take about 5 minutes, and we do really hope that you'll take the time to do that, because it is a really important tool for us so that we can really strengthen our services in the future, and we really care what you think about what's going on with what we're doing. So I did want to make sure that everybody has had a chance to download the materials, the handouts that are in the handouts pod. It has these slides on it, so if you missed anything, go ahead and grab that. And then we also, I've included some resources here from Child Welfare Information Gateway. They have a great, several great resources on this topic especially. And I am aware that this first bullet up here, foster parents considering adoption, they're in the process of updating that as we speak, is my understanding. So you might want to bookmark both of those and potentially come back to that one, because they're working on that right now. Have some really great information available through Child Welfare Information Gateway on all sorts of topics. I also wanted to make sure folks were aware of our website, where you can find many, many more resources. There's been a lot of requests for resources. That's where a lot of the questions were coming from. That's Sue and Maris, if you could be thinking while I'm doing this last bit of housekeeping of some resources that you want to share with folks as we close out. That was several questions about that. And then I want to make sure that folks are aware that they can access that either on our website. They can also access recorded webinars from the past on our YouTube channel and on our website. And then I'm going to leave our contact information up. This has both me, again, my name is Britt, and it also has Tracy Sarginian. She's been behind the scenes helping me out so much during this webinar, but she's the director of our capacity building and engagement team. And so if you have any system specific questions about about any assistance that you might need that we may be able to help you with, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to either Tracy or myself. And so with that, I'm going to leave that slide on. And Maris and Sue, any resource suggestions for anybody? Anything that they should check out?
Well, let me jump in real fast, because it is in June and July that the National Foster Parents Association and the North American Council on Adoptable Children have their major conferences. People should really go online, take a look at who's giving which workshops, and maybe they could, if they can't get to the conference, maybe they see what books have they written, are they somewhere else. I mean, that's, if there is no foster parent support group in your area, start one. All it takes is two foster parents sitting down together, or two agency people inviting the foster parents in. There should be, I hope, in every state some kind of an adoptive parent support group. NACAC, the North American Council on Adoptable Children, certainly has lists, of support groups around the whole country. People should never feel like they're alone. Sue, what do you think?
Yes, this is Sue. I absolutely 100% second that. And I also second something that Maris said about finding your sort of star parents and your agency, getting foster parents who potentially could become adoptive parents, or those families that are in transition, connected to other parents through support groups, through NACAC, through other conferences like that. The National Foster Parent Association also, later in the fall in October, is the Attach conference, which is another organization that has a lot of good resources. So I would really urge people to get in contact that way. But then the other way is through reading books, read books about, have a book club in your agency, have people read. I mean, our family wrote a book, but there's a lot of other books of, memoirs or stories of families who did this, who walked this path, who went this journey, or a movie watching night, just even the new movie that's come out, Instant Family, or other movies that have been around through the years that you can, or TV show, This Is Us, you can have some watching of things like that, and then talk about these issues in a way that sort of helps people feel comfortable. So I think there's lots and lots of great books and speakers on those, at those conferences and through those websites that we've mentioned. But also I think reading books and watching movies and then having a discussion group about them helps people put it in sort of day-to-day terms that are sort of feel real.
That's really great advice. I think that those everyday type of activities that we can all do and connecting folks with media like that, like Instant Family, is also a really great way to do it. It's not just, we have a lot of resources on Adopt US Kids or on Child Welfare Information Gateway, but there's also a lot available by folks with lived experience. And I think that's really important. I think it's really important to acknowledge the lived experience that Sue and Maris bring to this, and that we thank them so much for bringing to this. Another question that came in regarding the behavior challenges that tend to come that you were talking about, Maris. A question about how do you help foster parents understand that those behaviors are different than those that are clinical, that those that are based on mental health diagnoses, because they've been having some struggles with folks believing that of trying to help folks understand that they come from trauma and transition and change. And do you have any advice on how to talk to families to help them understand that?
Well, the first thing I would tell you is that, which everyone is welcome to have this, on the Family Focused Adoption Services website is an article that we wrote about inducement that people should share, because it helps families understand where does it come from, and why is it not mental illness? I mean, a child who's been a certain way forever and then all of a sudden starts acting out in ways that are different because they're feeling safe enough to, they're close to finalizing an adoption, the way you know it's inducement is the intensity of the feelings that are engendered in the family, usually in the mother, not always, but usually. So a mother will call up who's had a wonderful adoption, will call up at office and say, I don't understand it. I never felt like this before. This kid makes me angrier than I've ever been in my life. It's frightening because what is the kid feeling? Angry and frightened and confused and, pushing and unconsciously communicating with the parent. It's different. It's not the same as children with mental health issues because it only starts when they're getting ready to finalize, and it evokes very intense feelings in the parent. That's how you know, for instance, that it's not regular adolescent stuff, because it evokes this intensity. It's in the article. I mean, the other thing is you can't have a kid live with you in your house who's, making you crazy by setting fire to your kitchen curtains or something. But that doesn't mean you give them up. Once you understand that this is your kid healing, then you go with them to get whatever support you need, but they're your child that's getting the support. See, it feels terrible, but it's really wonderful. Take a look at the article. That might be of some help because it's right out there.
Could you say again the website that's on, and we could potentially include that in the follow-up email?
Oh, that would be great. The agency is Family Focus Adoption Services. So you can Google that and you get the website, and there's resources, articles on there. Help yourself. There's lots of stuff about ceremonies too, about adoption ceremonies.
Wonderful. Thank you. Sue, I think you wanted to add something.
I did want to just add to that, and it might at first sound like I'm almost contradicting Maris, but I want to be clear that I'm 100%. Everything she's just said is absolutely true. And in addition, I want to say to the person who asked the question, and it also doesn't 100% matter if you can distinguish if a behavior is trauma related or mental health related. Yeah. For the parent in the home, in those moments when it's happening, you don't have to know. You have to believe that it's possible that this could be trauma related. You have to believe that it's possible that this could be related to the shifting and changing of our relationship. And therefore, by having that belief, you also then have hope that there are things you can do about it. And the very things that Maris suggested, those kinds of articles and supports. Also, one of the books that my daughter and I wrote, which is called Building Bridges of Hope. And it's a whole workbook of practical activities you can do in your home, or a worker can do as a assignment with a family, very practical things about how to help children through these behaviors. You don't have to be the therapist, you don't have to be the clinician, you don't have to get the ultimate answer, what is causing this. You still have to believe, okay, this is possible, this could be about the trauma, this could be about the adoption, and therefore there's things I can do about it, and have that hope, and then move on and do those practical things.
That's great. I think that is actually a great place for us to close out. I know that because we're right at the 90-minute mark, we're like 90 seconds away from it. So I know that there were many questions, a lot of folks that we did not get to. I have written to, I think, almost everybody that we're going to try and follow up with you individually to try and get questions asked if we weren't able to do that. I wanted to make sure, again, not to be a broken record, but please do look out for the email from Adopt US Kids Evaluation. We greatly appreciate any feedback that you can provide. Any and all of it really helps us to craft these events and publications that we make on into the future so that they're meeting your needs the best that we can. I also want to thank Maris and Sue again for bringing your expertise to this. It's been endlessly helpful to hear from you with both your professional and lived experience, and we thank you so much. And thank you all for spending time with us today. We know that you guys are very busy people, and we thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. You will receive a follow-up email from us with the link to this recording if you missed any part of it. And thank you so much again. Y'all have a great rest of your day.